Hello and welcome once again to my channel where I take you on my journey, um, trying to teach you Oracle technologies for your personal and professional development. If you like my content, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Also, do not forget to enable notifications so that you stay informed of when I release new content. So if you've been following this channel, we've done a lot of work on data guard configurations. We've configured data guard standby databases for single instance databases. We've configured data guard services standby from a single instance to primary to a rack standby database. And we've also configured data guard broker, which is like I mentioned in one of my videos, an application programmer interface that automates kind of log shipping. It manages that for you automatically. It's a cool Oracle tool. So today, our exercise is going to be on data guard switchover. And I'm going to use two methods. The first one would be SQL Plus, which is commonly called the manual method. And the other one would be using the data guard broker, using the DGMGRL interface. Now, why is this important? Every company must have a risk management program, which should include a disaster recovery as a key subcomponent. Disasters may happen, and we have to be ready for that. So what companies typically do is, especially for those that use Oracle, they use Oracle Data Guard, which ensures high availability, data protection, and disaster recovery for enterprise data. Now, disasters are usually not planned, so you want to be ready in the event that one happens. Now, when we talk about switchover or disaster recovery, companies usually have at a certain frequency, at the very least every year, they do what we call annual DR testing, disaster recovery testing. And during that time, they try to perform what we call a switchover between the primary database and the standby database. So what that simply does is it does what we call role transition. So the primary database switches over to the standby database, which eventually becomes the new primary database. And then that, of course, is switched over as well. Now, if that process is a little bit more intensive, then applications are going to be switched over to the standby just to make sure that it works. There are different variations on how companies do this. I've had experience with companies that do switchovers every couple of months. So they switch between their primary and standby every couple of months. There are some that would do that every year. So depending on how the maximum availability architecture has been determined for that company, that's what they're going to go with in terms of service level agreements. When we talk about switchover, we also have to mention failover because these are two separate components. So when we talk about a switchover, it is a role reversal, like I mentioned earlier, between the primary database and one of its standby databases that is in the configuration that that primary has multiple standby databases. So a switchover guarantees that there is not going to be any data loss, and it's typically done for plant maintenance, right? So this is a planned event. And during a switchover, what happens is the primary database transitions to a standby role, and the standby database transitions to a primary role. Now, in the case of a failover is a role transition in which one of the standby databases is transitioned to the primary role after the original primary database fails for some other reason. So a failover may or may not result in data loss depending on the protection mode in which your data guard system has been configured. But this is usually a one-way traffic. So it fails over. And for that to be able to, for the database that failed or the server that failed, it has to be reconstructed. So without much ado, let's go ahead. Hopefully you enjoyed that summary. Let's go ahead and dive into our scenario here. So I have two databases. One is a primary on my PrimServe server, and one is a standby on my standby server. So let me set my environment. Let me see here. or env prim, and SQL plus as sysdba. All right, so let me select instance name, status from v $instance. These are all single instance databases. Okay, so that's prim, it's open. I would move over here to the standby side, env standby, and I would SQL plus as sysdba, and I would run the same command. Now, we are just trying to ascertain the state and roles of these databases. Now, what we want to find out as well is we would select name, database, role, open mode from our v $database. So let's take a look at that. So like I mentioned earlier, so this is my primary database, and it is in read and write mode. Now, I would run this same SQL on the standby side so that we can see here that this is a physical standby and it's mounted. All right. So I had configured already a data guard broker for this database. So if I exit out of here and I go over to DGMGRL, I connect as sys data guard, and I do show configuration. I should be able to see that my configuration is successful. And this is data guard 19C. So if I do show configuration lag, I should see here that, of course, my transport, there is no lag, and this is computed 0 seconds ago. So I'm shipping in real time. And I have different tabs here that are just for the alert logs of these two databases. So as we continue to make changes, we would see how this works. So now my first scenario would be trying to switch using the manual method, which is SQL plus. So I would head over down to scenario number 1. I would perform my switch over using SQL plus. Now, before that, let's just make sure if you're doing this within your system, I want you to make sure that you go through the steps and check out certain parameters, right? We are not worried about log shipping because data guard broker is taking care of that for us, right? I just want to worry about a few initialization parameters. So let's go back to SQL plus. Let me clear my screen so that we can get a little bit of visual. Post clear. And I would run some parameters here. So I'm just going to format my output. And I want to select this to see if I need to fix anything. So when we talk about data guard configurations, there is the log archive configurations, right? These are data guard specific configurations. Archive log, log archive -1, log archive -2, and this is, I have only one standby for this. So I'm using log archive -2 for that. So I don't have a file server. Now, if I try to run the verification, it is going to tell me that it doesn't identify a file server. And the reason I'm running this command right now is to identify some of these parameters that are critical to our role transition. So file server, file stands for fetch archive log. From the primary side, which server is it going to fetch archive logs from when eventually that role transitions? So our file server would be our standby database. So, so let's do a show parameter file. So currently the file client, which of course is, you know, the server on which it is, the database on which it is right now, is prim. So I will make a change to this, otherwise I would run into issues. So I would alter system set file client, so file server, I would set it to a standby. And this is a dynamic parameter. I can scope both. And if I was on a cluster system, of course, I would add the seed. And it really doesn't matter because this is, so let's go ahead and do the same thing for our standby database, which I'm sure is properly configured because we are shipping logs. Nice. Let's run this in SQL over here. Okay, so log archive dest 1 is looking good. Log archive dest 2 now, because this is the data guard configuration. When you configure data guard broker, somehow it automatically eliminates that log archive dest 2 parameter. But because I'm going to be using the manual method, I want to make sure that my log archive dest 1 parameters are set correctly, and my log archive dest 2 parameters are set correctly. So because this is empty, I will have to fix that. So on the standby side, I would have to run this command, alter system set log archive dest 2, and that is good. So if I go ahead and rerun this SQL, I should see that has been resolved. So my log archive dest 1 is good. My log archive dest 2 points to prim, which is good. For server is the primary database, of course, which is what is supposed to be. And everything is looking good right now. Let's take a look here again, and let's rerun that query. After I did that fix up, let's rerun that query to make sure that all the parameters are looking good. So log archive dest 1 is good. Dest 2 looks good as well. File server, log archive config, everything is looking good. So that is good. So you want to go down and make sure that these parameters are set right. Otherwise, you are going to run into issues when you're doing your role transitions, right? So now the other thing I want to take a look at is let's show parameter convert. And why is this important? When we were creating the data guide, we used a parameter convert, not a parameter convert, but a DB file name convert and a log file name convert, because our primary and our standby have kind of similar file structures, but the names are a little bit different for the databases. So we have to, do that parameter convert. Now, I just want to make sure that on both of them, on the primary side, if I am going to be receiving logs, the logs are going to convert from Aura data standby to Aura data prim, just to keep it consistent. So I want to make sure that I take a look here. And of course, this converts from prim right here to standby for our database file name and our log file name. So I just want to make sure that those parameters are set. Otherwise, we might have some issues when logs are being reapplied on the standby, whichever the standby is. Okay, so now, one of the things I need to mention is if you make a change to this parameter, it is not a dynamic parameter. So you would have to scope it to SP file. And in that event, you would have to reboot your database for that parameter change to take effect. So it's always a good thing to make sure that you look at, some of this as you're planning your disaster recovery. If you have it scheduled within your system, take a look at these parameters ahead of time and see if maybe, you need to make some changes to it before. All right. So one of the things when I'm doing the manual method, of course, we already saw if I didn't have data guard broker configured, then I would be going through all of this to make sure that MRP process is running, logs are being shipped, but we already have data guard broker. So we saw how that works. So in the interest of time, we'll keep moving forward. Now, in some circumstances, you might place some table spaces offline for table spaces that really, do not change. There are a variety of reasons, and we don't want to go into that. But there might be some data files or some table spaces that you would have put offline. If that is the event, you want to check on those. Again, let me clear my screen here. Let me check and see if I have any data files that are offline. If we have any data files that are offline, then we want to bring them back on before we make any change. we are looking at our, parameters, and so far, I mean, things are looking okay. So since I will be using the manual method and I don't want DataGuard Broker to interfere with my, switchover exercise, I would go ahead and disable my DataGuard configuration. Okay, so I would exit out of SQL Plus and I would head over to DGMGRL, DGMGRL, and let me show configuration one more time. So it says my configuration right here, of course, is successful, right? I have a configuration running. So what I want to do is I want to disable that configuration. So I want to disable that configuration. If I disable that configuration, of course, then DataGuard Broker is not going to help me ship logs anymore. So if I do show configuration, it tells me, of course, that my configuration has been disabled. So at this point, I don't really have anything helping me shipping logs anymore. I would have to manually, use reapply that SQL that starts the apply services. Now I'm disabling this first of all, because, and it's good practice, before you want to do anything in terms of role transitions between your primary and your standby, my recommendation, at least for what I do personally, is I try to create a guarantee restore point. We are all technologists and we know technology can play tricks on us so many different ways. So I always like to have a good fallback plan. So I like to create a restore point. That is in the event that things don't go the way I want, at least I have a fallback plan. Because if you don't have a fallback plan, then you might be looking to recover from backups. You might be looking at, losing data, and depending on your recovery point objectives, or recovery time objectives, or your SLA agreements, you might be in breach. So I usually just like to be, of course, on the safe side. So I would, from the primary side, and maybe from the standby side, let me first of all clear host clear or host clear, and I would stop apply services on this side. I would stop apply services. So first of all, let's check here. So let's check if MRP is running. Let's check if MRP is running. All right, so there's MRP, of course, is running because, of course, logs are being applied. Now, what I would do is, of course, I would cancel recovery. So because if recovery is running and I try to create a guarantee restore point, it's going to tell me the media is incompatible. So let's stop that. And then, of course, from the primary side, I would create a restore point. I'll just give it a generic name, switchover guarantee restore point. I'll just give it a name, create restore point, switchover guarantee restore point, guarantee flashback database. Let's create that restore point. I'll create that both on primary and I'll create that on standby. And if I want to see if that restore point has been created, I would select name from the $restore point. That would give me, my restore point right here. So I'll do the same on the primary side just to confirm that that restore point has been created. Now, you have to remember to drop these restore points after your exercise has been done. Because if you leave those restore points, flashback logs are they're going to continue to get captured, and that could have a negative effect on your flash recovery area. Okay, so guarantee restore point is done. So I would restart my MRP process. Now, if this is, of course, a rack system, and I don't really need to talk about that, but I've found in my experience that what works best for me is if both DataGuard and primary database, if primary and standby database are rack nodes, what I do is I typically shut down all the other nodes except, the nodes that are, from one node from the primary. No, one for the primary is good, but at least one node from the standby database that is applying. Usually that works better for me. Okay, so let's go back to our standby database and let's restart apply services. So let's go ahead and do that. Recovery process is started. This is on our standby alert log that I'm trailing. I just want to make sure that, let me alter system switch log file to make sure that everything is working right. So that's good. So it seems to be moving. So, all right, so let's perform our switchover then. Now, before I perform a switchover, I want to make sure that I check what we call the gap status, right? There has to be no gap in the redo. So on the primary side, I would run a select status gap status from the $v archive dest status, where the dest ID is 2 because I'm using log archive destination 2. So this is what I like to see. Sometimes you might see, something here, for example, resolvable gap. And there are simple ways of solving a resolvable gap, but you have to make sure that you see a no gap before you proceed. If you see anything other than no gap, you want to resolve whatever is causing. You could look at the alert logs to find out what's happening. All right. This is kind of redundant, but if I say no, if I say, if I try to choose, it says no gap. So I shouldn't be looking for delay, but it's always a good thing to see that. So there is no delay. So before I do a role transition, I want to make sure that I show you guys what role this database is running from. So this is a primary database. I expect to see the primary database role, but there is also from the $v database view, the switchover status. And that is critical for me to see. Sometimes it doesn't say to stand by. And whatever it says at that point, you should be able to find a solution and resolve it before you attempt to switch over. If it doesn't say to stand by, your switchover is not going to work. Okay. So I would verify the possibility of it switching over first before I eventually do the switchover. So this gives me an opportunity to look at the alert logs and see if in its verification it identified any issues that we needed to resolve. So alter database switch over to standby, which is the name of the standby database. You're asking the database to switch over to standby, but I'm using the keyword verify. So we're not actually going to switch, but we're going to verify the standby switch. Usually when it goes quickly like this, it's a good sign. I take a look at the alert log, and if I find any errors here, or sometimes on your terminal screen, it is going to tell you what the error is. But always make sure that you run a verify first, and make sure that you resolve any issues if there were before you proceed to standby. So everything looks good at this point. So I don't have any errors. So I'm going to switch over to standby database. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. So switch over to standby. Let's go. The primary log, if we kill the alert log right now, it is going to tell us what's happening, and we tell the alert log of the standby, it is going to tell us exactly what's happening. Now, with the manual method, unfortunately, when the role transitions, your standby is going to be in a mounted state. And then you would alter that database and open it, which now becomes the primary. So our standby database right now, it is in a mount state. Okay, so the database has been altered. Switchover has been completed if you're looking at this. Now the downside, not really downside, because this is going to be the new standby, it shuts down this instance. The difference between this and DataGuard is DataGuard does all of this all by itself, so you don't have to do any manual intervention. So with our primary database, so if I go ahead here and select the database, open mode, and all of that stuff from the database, it is going to tell me, let's go ahead and type that manually. So select name, database role, open mode from v $database. So right now it's going to tell me now that this standby database, of course, it calls the database prim because you know with the data configuration, the database names are the same. What's different is the unique name. So the unique name standby. This database right now, which is on our standby server, has now become the primary database, but it is in a mounted state. So we have to alter database open. And our standby database has now become our primary database. Now, on this other side, the alert log told us that the instance was shut down completely. So we would have to, let's exit out of this, or let's try to start up. And we have, of course, with our standby databases, unless you're running active data guard, we want to start it up in a mount state. Okay, our database has started. It is getting mounted. On this other side, our logs, it is now in an open state. So if we run this command again, it's going to say we are now open in read and write on the standby serve on what used to be our standby database. This now, certainly, if we run that same command here, we would see now that this database on this side is now our new standby database. So physical standby database, it is now mounted. So why don't we go ahead and start and restart log shipping? And then we see how things are going from that side. Let's go ahead and restart our log shipping, disconnect from session. So it's starting up our recovery process, and we're going to manually check to see if our logs are being shipped. So it's clearing online redo logs. Like I mentioned, there are many steps or many phases that it goes as it gets this ready. So let's go ahead and do some checks. Let's look at what is our primary right now. Let's see what that says. So last, sequence generated is 36. And we are going to look at the standby database and see if we have any correlation with that. So 36 as well. So let's look at the standby sequence applied. It has applied up to 35. So what I'll try to do here, let me alter database, alter system, sorry, switch log file. Let's switch a log file. Let me see, what did I do? Alter system, switch log file. System altered. So it tells you here, once you see the alert log start jumping, it tells you here, of course, that we are shipping. And I like that. So, so that is the forward switchover. Now we have switched over what used to be a primary database has now become a standby. And what used to be our standby database has now become a primary. So we are looking good on this side. So again, just another double check. Let's take a look at this. Where is the standby? This is our standby side now. So the max sequence, and then let's look at max sequence on this side, 37. And then let's look at our data gap processes. So this is currently applying, and we don't really need to run that on this side. So we need to run that just on the standby side. So we are currently applying logs. So that is good. Now, if this, depending on what your GR testing is, there may be a need for you to signal to application team and say, hey, the databases have now been switched over. And then maybe, they can point their applications to the new standby database that is now the primary database and run some workloads to see if, the standby database, of course, which is now the new primary, can support those workloads and successfully, ensure business continuity in the event of a disaster. Now, let's assume that we've done, our part, application team have done their part, everyone has done their part. And now they say, all right, testing over. Let's switch back to where we were before. So we go back through the same process, right? So we go back to the primary and make sure that we don't have any gaps. Let's go ahead and check on that. Let's make sure we don't have any gaps. So there is no gap. And we want to make sure that our switchover status on the current primary says we are able to go back to standby. All right. So database role, we can switch over, to standby. And that is exactly what we want to see. Okay. So again, before we do any switchover, we want to verify that possibility of switching over. We'll look at the alert logs to see if that gave us any errors, which apparently it doesn't. So it looks like if we actually perform our switch over operation, we should be able to go to completion without any issues. So alter database switch over to primary. And then let's do that. So we look again at our alert logs, and again, we shall see how lots of things are going. So switch over to primary, and it goes quickly. So database has already been altered. Now, the same thing that happened before on our primary database, the instance was shut down. But now this same instance, if I take a look at this instance right now, it should show me that this instance is now the primary database instead of the standby database. All right. So let's select open mode and database role and all of that stuff, but it would be in a mounted state. All right. And when it's in a mounted state, of course, we just alter database, open. And everything should be looking good. Now, what used to be the primary database here is is shut down completely. So we have to restart this database, of course, in a mount mode. And then, of course, we enable log shipping. And our exercise on the first case scenario, which we are using manually, should be done. So we are going to do no delay, alter database, switch a few logs and see if everything is going as planned. So let's go ahead here. All current non-online redo logs have been archived. So let's alter system switch log file. And let's see if there is activity on our alert logs, which apparently is the case. And so recovery of online redo thread this. And then, of course, we can go ahead and verify using the SQLs that we've had before. Okay. So we can look at this. Let's go back to, that's the MAC sequence generated. That's the MAC sequence. And within our data guide processes, we want to see if we have, this should be applying. So, so there is our recovery log merger here that's currently applying. Okay. There are many ways that we can look to monitor, our data guide setups. I just want to check with the primary again, if maybe, say there is any gap or anything. And if, of course, there is no gap, we are good, right? So this would be scenario one, the end of scenario one, using SQL apply, using a SQL plus to manage our switchovers. So let's go back to data guide brokers. So DGMGRL, And we would try to use, of course, the data guard broker in order to manage, a switchover. So let's show configuration. Remember, we had disabled our configuration. So show configuration, it's disabled. So we enable our configuration. And you can use any of these methods, right? With data guard broker, there are some error messages that data guard broker would give to you that you may be able to ignore. If you're not familiar with how to use data guard broker, there is a lot of documentation on that, especially on Oracle support. They have a lot of documentation regarding how or what to watch for if you're using data guard broker. All right. So let's go ahead and double check. We are going to enable our configuration. It's going to take over our redo apply process. And I would see here, sometimes it might take a little bit, show configuration lag. This command show configuration lag may not work for Oracle version 12. It's a new feature for 19C. If you're looking for the lag and you cannot see it using show configuration lag, you can show database and then the standby database. In our case is STBY. It is going to show you how much of a lag you have in terms of transport lag. All right, so everything is looking good. Now, with data guard broker, it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit quicker. All I need to do, because I connected from my primary server into my data guard broker, I want to connect my data guard broker to my standby database. All right. Now, before I do that, I just want to maybe check a few things. So show database verbose. Let's look at our primary and our standby databases just to make sure I'm looking at a few things. There are some parameters that are needed and are important if you're using data guard broker for log shipping, of course, and for switchover exercises. The static connect identifier, in my opinion, if it's not set properly, would pose a lot of problems for you if you don't have that set right. So let's look at database verbose for our standby database. So it tells me success, right? That is exactly what I want to see in both of them. Success, success. I don't anticipate any issues. So when I want to switch over, so again, let me repeat. I am connecting to data guard broker from the primary server. So I have to connect to the standby server, STBY. Now, I don't like, as general practice, putting in the password for the sys user on the terminal. I usually just do the @STBY, and then it's going to prompt me for password, and Oracle is my password. So I'm connected to the standby database, connected to STBY, as you can tell. At this point, I will validate the standby database, validate database STBY. And just to make sure that I do it once, I would use the verbose STBY so that it gives me everything that I need to see. All right. So you want to look at a few things here. So verbose is going to give you a lot of information, right? You want to make sure that you look at, there's going to give you a lot of stuff. Flashback status, manage clusters, no. One of the things I kind of really want to make sure that I pass that validation, otherwise it's going to give you a warning, is the static connect identifier. If this is not set right, you may be able to switch over, but you may not be able to come back to what was the primary database before. So you want to make sure that static connect parameter for the prim database, of course, is set well. So far, it tells me there is no issue that it sees. All right, there is no lag. And then, of course, it tells me, of course, that there are sufficient redo logs, right? And that's why we configure those redo logs and those standby. We configure standby logs and add one per thread for each of the databases. All right. So it tells me that, of course, there are 3 online redo logs and there are 4 standby redo logs. So there are sufficient. So that's the case in both primary and standby. So we should be able to go forward with that. So if my validation comes clean like this, my validate database, and I can run this again without the verbose, so that gives us a little bit STBY. It just gives us a quick summary here without the verbose. This is what you see. All right. So now that I'm able to validate that, then I would role switch right now, all with, it's just one simple command. Switch, if I can type, that would be right. Switch over to STBY. And that is all that I need to type. And if I hit enter, it's now performing switchover. Now we can look at the alert logs, but it's also going to give you terminal output here as it proceeds. All right, let's give it a few. So it tells you exactly what it's doing, starting instance prim, connected to an idle instance. So it does all of that stuff for you. So it's mounting this database, which is now going to be the new standby. And for this one, it will open this database completely. And this would be the new, would become the new primary. So let's see here, it's mounted. Switchover succeeded, new primary is now the standby. So this is pretty neat. So if I show my configuration right now, I should be able to see that the roles have transitioned. So standby has now become the primary database, and prim has now become the physical standby. Remember when we did this configuration before, and I would have to scroll a little bit up. We had a configuration before where prim was the primary database and STBY was the physical standby. So right now, standby is the new primary and primary is the new standby. So let's show configuration lag. All right, there might be a few warnings. I'm not sure. It might take a little bit to sync up. It might take a little bit to sync up. So let's see what's going on. All righty. I'm going to show database prim, which is now the current standby. Let's see what's going on. Oh, now it's successful. So like I said, it just needed to take a little bit. So show configuration should be good. So all it needed to do was take a few minutes to kind of reset. And now our logs are being transported with no lag. Just to confirm again, so show database prim. So we have no lag. So everything is looking nice and good. So again, we are able to, switch over using DataGuard Broker to what used to be the physical standby is now the primary, and what used to be the primary is now the standby, as you can tell from our configuration here. So let's go over to the standby, because usually when you're launching, when you're launching the switchover command, you want to launch from which server happens to be the standby. You're connecting to that database itself. So let's connect sys at prim. And then of course my password is Oracle. And then let's validate database prim. Let's do that. And again, this is what I wanted to see. I wanted to make sure that my static connect identifier comes back with no warning. This is, of course, the short version of the validate database. But if I wanted us to take a look at the verbose, which is the longer version with a little bit more detail, it would tell us about the redo logs and all of that stuff, same stuff that we saw before. So let's return to what we were before, switch over to prim. Let's do that. So we're switching over to prim, and it's performing the same things that it performed while we were doing the switch over to standby. So we'll look at the terminal output. when everything, confirms that switchover is complete, we're going to check our configuration. We're probably going to have to give it a few seconds for it to sync up. Check our configuration, and if all goes well, then you would have been able to see how we can do a switchover using two methods. First method, SQL apply, using SQL plus, the manual method. Second method, using the data gap broker. So our switchover has succeeded. So the new primary is prim. Usually it's a good thing when you see these confirmation messages. There have been times, believe it or not, where you can really get a headache out of this. All right, so let's show our current configuration. So configuration, nice. So let's show configuration lag. If there is no lag. So let's show database standby STBY, and we are currently shipping. We don't have any lag. Now, if you want to confirm that, of course, if you want to go into SQL plus assist DBA and you select gap to see the gap status, where is that, my nice little command here? Gap status, just to make sure that we don't have any gaps. All right, so folks, here is the end of our demo. I hope this was informative for you. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit the like button. It helps with the YouTube's algorithm. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Enable notifications, like the video, share with your friends. It might help somebody. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.